And now, if you could please join me in welcoming to the stage our chairman, who's also the chairman of Henry Crown and Company, and also a director at the Lurie Children's Hospital, the Lyric Opera, the Commercial Club, and the Jerusalem Foundation, Mr. Lester Crown. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Neil. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We're delighted to have you here tonight. You know, my job tonight supposedly is to introduce Walter Isaacson to you. And on reflection, I've decided it was a silly thing to do because all of you know about Walter or you wouldn't be here tonight. But since he isn't within earshot at this time, I do want you to know that he's absolutely brilliant. He has unbelievable ingenuity. And more than anything else, he is really one of the nicest and most decent human beings that you will ever meet. And I hope you do get a chance to meet him afterwards. Walter spent a number of years as the editor of Time, and I think it was a job that he absolutely loved. He then went over and became the head of CNN television, and frankly, I think it was a job he did not like. And that is when really the Aspen Institute hit the jackpot. Literally, we were called by a friend of ours, 4 or 5 of us from the Institute who were on the search committee, were called by a friend of Walter's and a friend of ours. We were within about 2 weeks of hiring one of 2 people as the president of the Aspen Institute. And he said, you know, Walter Isaacson really would like to leave CNN, and this is the perfect job for him. You ought to talk to him. We each did, I think, within about a 10-day period. And of course, it was a laydown after that. It was just a question of trying to convince Walter that he should come to the Institute, and fortunately we did. And as I say, we hit the jackpot at that time. The Institute, I think, as you know, was formed originally by a Chicagoan, Walter Pepke, who was the president of Container Corporation here right after the Second World War. And it has developed a reputation as one of the premier conveners of really some of the best minds in the world. And then Walter has taken it really from that point, since it existed for about 60 years before that, even to new heights. His ingenuity and really his foresight. I don't know how many of you have been at the Ideas Festival in Aspen. It was formed for 1 week to bring in, again, some of the finest minds all throughout the world. It starts, people come in as lecturers, as interviewees, as interviewers, as to parts of seminars. It starts at 7:30 in the morning and it goes through to 10:30 at night, so you know how many people are involved. After the first year, we had to move it to 2 years, and it sold out really an hour after the doors, after we announced that what the program is for the next year. I want to take 1 minute at this point really to divert on a personal note. Renee and I have a grandson who just graduated from Duke last year and has spent the last 2 summers as an intern at the Aspen Institute. And fortunately for last year, he became Walter Isaacson's chief gopher. And as such, he became the seeing eye dog for many of the dignitaries who came to town. When the last issue of Forbes came out, that I think it was the 50 most influential people in the world, Connor called and said, "Grandpa, I can't believe it. I have met most of those people." Walter Isaacson's Rolodex at this point, while he is not running the Institute, He's lecturing all over the country. He's done a fabulous job on really the reconstruction of New Orleans, which is where he came from. He serves on a number of boards like United Airlines, and in his spare time, which that's kind of an oxymoron by itself, he has written a couple of small novels, as you've seen out between, with Kissinger, Benjamin Franklin, Einstein, and Steve Jobs. So, and they are all, by the way, absolutely superb. If I ever recommended anything to anyone, I'd recommend all four, and I can't tell you which one to read first. They are just absolutely terrific. So it's my pleasure tonight to introduce Connor Crown's boss, Walter Isaacson.
Thank you, Lester. That was very, very nice. And I also want to thank Ivo. There are very few people in this world I respect more than Lester Crown and Ivo Daalder, although one of them is sitting in the front row, and that's Renee Crown. I respect her a lot more than anybody I've ever met. And I will tell you about Connor Crown. It was great to have him sort of as an aide de camp. At one point, Shimon Peres was there, and so I was brought in a great delegation to meet him when he arrived. And as we walked into the room, he beamed, and he stood up, and he looked like he was about to hug me. And he walked right to Connor and said, "Connor, it's great to see you again." So it's also great to be here with the Chicago Council. When Ivo came to my office, we talked about this and some other things, but we also decided, I hope, that by 2015 we're going to do a collaboration and hopefully have something together that will be a little bit like our Ideas Festivals and your ongoing Ideas Fest, where we can work together, because there is such a connection between Chicago, which I think is the greatest civic city I know. By that I mean a place where everybody's engaged in civic enterprises. I just love being in Chicago, and it is, of course, the birthplace of the Aspen Institute, so it's great for all of us to be home. When I came to the Aspen Institute after that story, I still don't know who called Lester, but I'll ask him later. I did get a phone call from Steve Jobs, which will lead into me talking about the lessons I learned from both Steve Jobs and then Ben Franklin and Albert Einstein. But I got a call from Steve, and I had known Steve off and on for about 20 years. He was, in 1984, in January of 84, he was putting out the Macintosh, that first great computer that he had, and he brought it to Time magazine to make sure, you know, that we covered it. I was about the only person at Time magazine who used a computer. I was very young, sort of my first year there, and so the big bosses had to bring me up to the meeting with Steve Jobs so they'd have one person there who knew what a computer was. But ever since then, especially after I became editor of Time and the head of CNN, he was my best friend 2 days a year whenever he had a product out and he wanted to make sure we were going to cover it correctly. But at that meeting in 1984, I saw both sides of Steve's amazing personality. I mean, he showed us the Macintosh and its beautiful curved chamfers, as he called them. The edges of it is a beautiful appliance. He made us look with a jeweler's loop at each of the pixels on the screen from that bitmap screen so that you could see exactly how the icons were done and the wonderful fonts. But deep into the meeting, he suddenly turned dark and he said, "You know, Time magazine stinks." He actually used a slightly more vivid word. He said, "You know, Newsweek's much better." And we both do a double take, all of us, and said, "Why?" He said, "Well, you should have made me Man of the Year last year, and you didn't." And I realized, whoa, you know, it was this sort of intensity. But despite that, I really got to like him. So I get this phone call after Lester had recruited me to come to the Aspen Institute, and he called to congratulate me. And I said, "Why don't you come and speak at Aspen?" He said, "Well, I'll come, but I want to take a walk with you." I had done my Benjamin Franklin book, just about to finish the book on Albert Einstein. And so Steve says, "Do me next." My first reaction was, "Yeah, you're arrogant, you know, little, you know, your humility hasn't deepened since our first meeting on making you Man of the Year." And I said, to be, put it off a bit, I said, yeah, I'd love to, but let's wait 20 or 30 years until you retire, and we let it pass. A while later, about 9 or 10 months later, somebody said to me, if you're going to do Steve, you got to do him now. And I realized I'd just sort of read something about him fighting cancer. I said, well, I didn't know he was fighting cancer. And the person who told me this said, yeah, he called you the day after he was diagnosed, but he didn't tell anybody. He kept it secret for 9 months, but you were the call he made. And that's when I realized it'd be very interesting to do something we very rarely get to do, which is to see a great titan of business and be very up close, get to spend a lot of time with that person and truly understand how that person's mind works. And here, as I began to think about it, was a guy who had transformed 6 or 7 industries. I mean, starting with that Macintosh, which was the first computer you could really take home in a box, take it out of the box, plug it in. It starts the home computer revolution. Likewise, he revolutionizes how we buy music, how we listen to music, cell phones, publishing, tablet computing, journalism, even retail stores and digital animation. Plus, he was the American creation myth writ large, somebody who had started a business in his parents' garage with the chubby kid from down the street and turned it into the most valuable company in the history of the world. And so I thought, well, this is going to be extraordinary. It's something I really want to do because we celebrate all types of leaders, but at the Aspen Institute, especially with our Business and Society program and our roots with Walter Pepka and other Chicago industrialists, including Lester's father, Henry Crown, the notion was celebrating a business leader, somebody who was creative and strong as a business leader. And in particular, I wanted to get somebody who was very imaginative, because that was the theme and the connection of the people I've written about, whether it's Franklin or Einstein or Kissinger. You would think, well, those people are really smart. Yeah, they do have that in common. But if you're a member of the Chicago Council, you've probably met a lot of really smart people, right? And you come to realize that smart people are a dime a dozen, and they don't usually amount to much. It takes imaginative people to amount to something, people with creative mindsets. And that's what set the people I wrote about apart, and that was especially true of Steve. When we first started working together, we'd take long walks, and he took me on a walk in the neighborhood where he grew up. And he made me look at the fence that at age 6 he had built with his father. It was a tract house in Central California, one of those cookie-cutter modern houses built in the 1950s. They were called Eichler homes, made by Joseph Eichler, who was a builder who did basically knockoffs of Frank Lloyd Wright-style designs, but for the everyman, for the suburban tract home. So very clean and modern and spare and sparse. And as we looked at the fence, Steve said to me, I want you to touch the back of the fence. My father, when we were building this, told me that we had to make the back of the fence just as beautiful as the front of the fence. And Steve had asked him, why? Nobody will ever see it. Nobody will ever know. And Steve's father said, yes, but you will know. And Steve said that was the first lesson I learned, that if you really care about something, if you really care about making a product good, if you really care about making it a piece of art, you have to care even about the parts unseen. And so when they were making that original Macintosh I told you about in late 1983, he saw how beautiful the case was and the icons were in the display, but he looked at the circuit board inside, and he said to the engineers, this circuit board stinks, it's ugly. They said, what do you mean? He said, well, the chips aren't lined up straight. They're not beautifully aligned. And they said, Steve, that's how you make a circuit board. Plus, you have it in the sealed appliance of a case that you're so proud of. Nobody can open up that case. Nobody will ever see it. Nobody will ever know. And Steve told him the story of his father and said, yes, but you will know. So they hold up shipping that original Macintosh for 6 weeks until they could make the circuit board inside beautiful. And when they did, Steve had them all sign a little whiteboard with his name, Stephen P. Jobs, all in lowercase in the middle. And they engraved it on the inside of the original Macintosh case, right next to that circuit board, where nobody will ever see it and nobody will ever know. But Steve said, real artists sign their work. And that was a pure lesson of Steve, because he told me over and over again, something those of you in business probably intuitively know and hopefully you act on, which is if you focus on making a really great product, eventually you'll have a really great company and you'll make some great profits. But if instead you focus on making profits, you might shave a little on the product. And in the end, you won't have a great company and it'll all be short term. And that was Steve's philosophy, which is in the end, make sure the product itself is insanely great and everything else will fall into place. He did that some with what was called by his colleagues a reality distortion field. Some of you, like me, probably were Star Trek fans growing up, and you remember the early episodes where the aliens could conjure up a galaxy by sheer force of will, make the laws of physics bend. And they called it the reality distortion field on Star Trek. Well, that's what the young engineers with Steve in the early days of Apple called Steve, because he kept bending reality by sheer force of will. It started early on, even before he founded Apple, when he and Wozniak, the kid from down the street, were working the night shift at Atari. Steve had gone to India to find his guru, dropped out of college, and when he had come back, he had a strict fruitarian diet. He only ate fruits and vegetables, no grains, no meats, no protein. And he told Al Alcorn, the chief engineer of Atari, that if you had such a diet, you didn't have to shower or use deodorant. And Al Alcorn said to me when I interviewed him, he said, that was a mistaken theory, so I put him on the night shift. But anyway, on the night shift, they're trying to make a game called Breakout, which was a single-player version of Pong. And Steve says to Wozniak, you got to code it, and you got to do it in 4 days, because we got to get back to the Apple farm, where that's hence the name of the company they eventually founded. Woz said, I can't do it in 4 days. Steve, you don't even know how to code that well. This is going to take me weeks. And Steve had taught himself when he was in India to stare without blinking. It was part of his Zen training. And he could stare at people. And Woz said, he just kept staring at me without blinking and saying, don't be afraid, you can do it. Woz finally said, I was so freaked out, I finally went back to my workbench and stayed up 4 nights in a row and coded the game Breakout. Over and over, Steve does that. It's that passion for getting things done. He did it with the original Macintosh that, when they were working on it, it took about 78 seconds to boot up. It was almost as slow as a Microsoft machine. And so Steve tells Larry Kenyon, you got to save 10 seconds off the boot up time. Larry Kenyon, who was the hardware engineer, said, look at this boot up sequence. There's no way you can do it faster. And Steve just kept staring at him without blinking and saying, don't be afraid, you can do it. Kenyon said, I got so freaked out. I went back to my cubicle, and after 2 weeks, I had shaved 28 seconds off the boot up time. Over and over again, it's that power to drive people crazy, drive them to distraction, but also drive them to do things they didn't think they could do that makes Steve both a real pain, a jerk. Actually, they have a technical term for it in Silicon Valley that starts with an A. But it also made him somebody totally transformative. The last story about this that always fascinated me is when he was doing the original iPhone, he didn't want it to have junky plastic on the front. He wanted to have really smooth, silky smooth glass that wouldn't scratch or smudge. But the glass they were getting from the autoclaves in China weren't up to his specifications. So it's at Aspen he met, John Seeley Brown, somebody who was on the Corning board. You all know the people from Corning, and you probably know the CEO, Wendell Weeks. So John Seeley Brown says, call Wendell Weeks at Corning. He might be able to help you. So Steve, being Steve, just picks up the phone, calls the switchboard at Corning and says, let me speak to your CEO. And the switchboard, being a CEO, said, well, give us your name and number. We'll have somebody call you. Steve slams down the phone and says, typical East Coast bull. Weeks, being a kind of cool guy, picks up the phone. Here's the story, and he picks up the phone and calls the switchboard in Cupertino at Apple. Says, let me speak to your CEO. And they say, well, put your request in writing and send it to us. And so Steve hears about that back channel and says, this is the type of businessman I like. So they met, and Steve explains what he needs in this type of glass. And Wendell Weeks said, well, you know, at Corning, a few years ago, we came up with a really great ion transfer process for making glass that would make exactly what you wanted. Here's how it works. We were going to call it Gorilla Glass. We never manufactured it. Steve went through the formula, talked to him for a while, and said, that's it. That's exactly what I want. I need this much by September because we're shipping in October. And Weeks said, well, I just told you, we've actually never made this glass before. And, you know, we can't have this much. And Wendell Weeks said, I actually went to Corning because I'm an old-fashioned reporter. I actually wanted to see this in person. Wendell Weeks said, it was totally amazing. This guy just sat right in front of me and stared at me without blinking. This is 30 years to the month that he had done it to Woz. He said, he just stared at me without blinking and said, don't be afraid, you can do it. And Weeks said, well, I know how to make glass, and you, don't be afraid, you can do it. So after the meeting was over, Wendell Weeks called a plant manager who he particularly liked, a Corning plant in Harrodsburg, Kentucky, right south of Lexington. Talked to the plant manager, said, I want you to switch over and make Gorilla Glass. And the manager said, okay, you know, we're doing flat screen TVs, it'll take us about a month or so. And Weeks said, I want you to do it tomorrow. So, and of course, the plant manager says, well, you know, what do we do? Blah, 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 blah. And Weeks said, I just kept telling him over the phone, over and over again, don't be afraid, you can do it. The upshot is that September, every piece of glass on every iPhone was made in Harrodsburg, Kentucky by Corning, and every piece of glass on every iPhone, iPad ever made since then has been made in America by Corning because of Steve's reality distortion field. Don't always try this at home. One of the things I do tell people is you will have people at the Chicago Council who are great management experts, and they say 7 steps to being a great executive or being innovative change or whatever. Biographies are not how-to books. You shouldn't sort of read them that way. And that's why, fortunately, we get to write lots of biographies, because they're different lessons of different people. You know, for Einstein, it was that same insatiable drive and curiosity. And when he was 6, those of us who are biographers love the tales of the kid when they're 6, sort of the rosebud, that shapes things. But his father gave him a compass. And Einstein, you know, was mesmerized. The needle twitched, it pointed north. And, you know, every time he'd go around and turn it, twitch it, and nothing was touching the needle. It was a physical object, but there was nothing touching it, and yet it moved. And so he was mesmerized with this concept of a force field. He said he walked around for days thinking about it. Now, you and I probably remember getting a compass when we were 6. And, you know, you say, wow, cool, look, the needle points north. And then a few, you know, 30 seconds later, it's like, oh, look, a dead squirrel. And we're on to something else. The rest of his life, Einstein is totally fixated on what is that force field? How does it interact with a particle? Why does the needle twitch and point north? Over and over again, you know, he's trying to do it. When he's 17, he runs away, just like Steve Jobs drops out and runs away, Ben Franklin drops out and runs away, Einstein drops out of school in Germany and runs away. This is why I don't get asked to give graduation speeches, since they all drop out. Anyway, so Einstein, you know, he's still trying to figure this out, and he looks at Maxwell's equations, which define an electromagnetic wave, how it travels. And if you look at Maxwell's equations, or if you're Einstein and you look at Maxwell's equations, they say something pretty amazing, which is the light wave, the electromagnetic wave, will always travel at the same speed. Constant speed, 186,000 miles per second or so. Whether you're going really fast to the source of the light or you're riding along with the light really, really fast in the direction of the light, you'll look at the light wave, it'll still be traveling relative to you at a constant speed. And Einstein says, well, what happens if I catch up with it? Wouldn't the wave look stationary? You know, wouldn't I be able to catch up with it and it wouldn't be moving at that fast if I were traveling at the speed of light. But Maxwell's equations don't allow for that. And Einstein said, I walked around the forest for days on end worrying about this, so much so that my palms started sweating. Now, I remember what was causing my palms to sweat growing up in New Orleans at age 17, and it wasn't Maxwell's equations. But this guy is so fixated on why does that needle twitch and point north? So he can't, he finally goes to college, but he can't get his doctorate accepted, his dissertation is rejected, he can't get a job. He's finally a third-class examiner in the Swiss Patent Office because he couldn't be a second or first-class examiner because he didn't have his degree. And, he's sitting on the stool still worrying about this concept of the speed of light and why it's constant. And one of the things he's looking at for patent applications is devices that will synchronize clocks, because the Swiss had just gone on standard time zones. And if you've ever met any Swiss people, and those of you in the Chicago Council probably met a few Swiss people, they tend to be rather Swiss. They really wanted to strike 7 in Zurich at the exact same moment as strike 7 in Bern or Basel or wherever. And the only way to do that, to synchronize the clocks, is to send a signal between the two clocks, and the signal travels at the speed of light, whether it's a radio or light signal, whatever. And you got this patent examiner sitting on a stool saying, well, what if I cut up with the light beam? And he keeps thinking about that. He says, well, if I'm riding alongside the light beam, what looks synchronized to me, if I'm riding towards one of the clocks, will be different than what looks synchronized to somebody else who's going really, really fast towards the other clock because of the nanosecond it takes a signal to reach you. And from that mental experiment, nothing in the lab, no data, no nothing, a thought experiment, he called it. From that little thought experiment, he comes up with a simple leap of the imagination, which is, I get it, the speed of light is always constant, but time is relative. What's simultaneous is relative, depending on your state of motion. That's all the special theory of relativity is. A leap made by a patent clerk in 1905 who, like Steve Jobs, was willing to question conventional thinking and think different. Because every other physicist trying to figure out this problem had read Newton, as Einstein had, but they believed Newton, who says at the very beginning of the Principia, time marches along second by second, no matter how we observe it. And you got this patent clerk saying, how do we know that? How would we test that theory? What if I were riding really fast towards one clock, wouldn't it? And so that ability to think different, to think out of the box. Sometimes I talk about this story, about his ability to think out of the box, and people come up to me afterwards and they say, I'm just like Einstein. And I kind of look at them and go, yeah, uh-huh. Why? And they say, because I think out of the box. And I have to remind them, he knew what was in the box before he thought out of it. So, it's those type of desire to defy, to think different, that you see in the rebellious imagination. That, to me, is the essence of innovation and creativity. I think Franklin had that as well, but I'm going to end with a different thought about Benjamin Franklin, my third biography subject. Because Benjamin Franklin always was experimental, he always thought out of the box, but he did something very relevant to the Chicago Council or to the Aspen Institute, which is, unlike Steve Jobs, unlike Einstein, he really knew the importance of bringing people together and having people think collectively and collaboratively. He was somebody who really knew how to unify people rather than divide them, something we need to know better in our society, I think. When he was young and he runs away, he goes over to England to buy printing equipment because he wants to set himself up as a printer in Philadelphia. And when he gets back, he starts a club like this. It was called the Leather Apron Club. And what it was a group of people who met twice a week to discuss issues just like you would discuss here, including issues like, does immigration make Philadelphia a stronger economy or a weaker economy? They also discussed scientific issues like, why does it take one day less to get to England than it does to come back? And Franklin was charting the Gulf Stream at the time. They even look at the poor laws. Does welfare reduce incentives to work, or does it help form a stronger society? They looked at the empirical evidence on various things. They were very much people of the Enlightenment, and what they also did was because they were trying to create a new type of society, they said, what are the traits you need to be a good leader in our civic community, to be a good business leader? And they wrote a list of them, 12 of them at first. And if you read Franklin's autobiography, you can see them listed. They're industry, honesty, frugality. And Franklin, being kind of a geek, puts them on a chart, and he marks each week how well he's done against each of those virtues on the chart. And at one point, he's able to master all 12 of the virtues, and he proudly shows it around to the other people in the Leather Apron Club. And one of the people in the club says to him, you know, Franklin, there's a virtue you've forgotten on your list. And Franklin says, well, what's that? And the friend says, humility. You might want to try that one for a change. And what Franklin says, I love it. It's a letter to his sister Jane, but also in his autobiography. He says, I was never very good at the virtue of humility. I could never master it. But I was very good at the pretense of humility. I could fake it very well. But here's the genius of Franklin. And he said, and I soon learned that the pretense of humility was just as useful as the reality of humility, because it made you listen to the person next to you. It made you try to find the common ground with what they were saying, and that was the essence of the middle-class democracy we were trying to create back then. And so that was Franklin's way of always bringing people together. If not showing the humility you need for a democracy, at least the pretense of humility you need, which is the belief that other people's opinions should be balanced into the equation, that you may think they're wrong, but you have to accommodate what they think, or at least show you're willing to accommodate what they think. Over and over, Franklin is able to do this. This is a type of virtue that's different from figuring out the theory of relativity or how to make an insanely great personal computer. But it is the essence of what great business and great countries and great cities are made of, which is knowing how to get people to work together. You see it over and over again in his life. Even when he comes back from London, having failed to prevent the American Revolution, and the Continental Congress has created a committee to describe why we're having this revolution, to write a declaration explaining it. It's probably the last time Congress created a great committee, but it's Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Ben Franklin are among the people on it. And Jefferson gets to write the first draft, and here's where you see Franklin bringing things together. Jefferson, in that unbelievably wonderful second sentence, begins it in the first draft by saying, we hold these truths to be sacred. And if you look at the first draft, which is in the Library of Congress, it's on display every now and then, you see Franklin's printer's pen, dark black pen with the backslashes the printer makes, crossing out the word sacred and writing self-evident. And he explains to the committee that we're trying to create a new type of nation in which our rights come from rationality and reason and the consent of the governed, not from the dictates or dogma of a particular religion. But the sentence goes on, and it says, they're endowed with certain inalienable rights. And you see John Adams' handwriting, endowed by their creator. It's actually stuck up there with a little caret, just like you and I would, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. And just in the editing of one half of one sentence, you see them balancing the role of divine providence and the role of rationality and reason in creating our rights. I remember studying that and looking at the drafts. I was down in Atlanta, as Lester said, not exactly wild about my job at CNN, which, I just wasn't made for cable TV shout shows. But I got in that morning after I was looking at some of this and sketching out that chapter, and 7 o'clock morning meeting, ungodly hour, which is also what they do in Atlanta. They wake up at 6 and have meetings at 7. And so somebody said, we have a great crossfire show. I said, what's that? They said, Judge Moore down in Alabama, he's put the 10 Commandments on the steps of the courthouse, and a federal judge has told him to take it off, and he won't do it. They're going to send in the federal marshals. And I said, oh, great. And somebody said, yeah, we got to find somebody for the 10 Commandments and somebody against the 10 Commandments. I remember going home that night and thinking, wait a minute. Here we are, American journalists and American politicians, using the 10 Commandments to divide us. Well, I'm trying to write about how beautiful it was, our founders doing that balance and bringing us together. Frank, you see that over and over again with Franklin. This is why when I was asked about the ask, I said, yeah, I think that sounds good. But it goes over and over with Franklin, and of course the greatest of all times is at the Constitutional Convention 12 years later, where it's pulling itself apart over the big state, little state issue. The Connecticut Compromise has gone down in flames. It looks like we're not going to survive as a united government because we can't get the Constitution done. And Franklin is there. He's old. He's 82 at that time, which back then was actually pretty old. And he gets up and he says, I'm older than everybody in this room. And the older I get, something really strange happens to me. I realize that I'm fallible. I realize I'm wrong at times. It was that wonderful pretense of humility he was so good at. He said, but it's going to happen to you. You're going to get older, and you're going to realize, gee, I was wrong. He didn't say gee, but he said, you know, this is a speech. It's a beautiful thing. He says, you're going to realize that you too were wrong at times. And so look at the person next to you and look at the people at the table around you and assume that maybe their arguments will turn out to be right and yours will turn out to be wrong. And let's see if we can put together this Constitution. He said, when we were young tradesmen in Philadelphia and we had a joint of wood that didn't quite fit, we'd take a little from one side and you'd shave a little from the other until you had a joint that would hold together for centuries. And so too, we here must each part with some of our demands. And his point was that compromisers may not make great heroes, but they do make great democracies. And that's something that surely we seem to have forgotten in Washington these days. So he's the one who says, let's have a, you know, he's the one who puts in the motion to have the House be proportional, Senate equal votes per state, and he tells them to line up and sign it by state. And most of them do. And when they do, he points to the back of Washington's chair and said, I often wondered whether that was a rising sun or setting sun on the back of General Washington's chair. But now I know it's a rising sun. And Mrs. Powell, this great old matron of Philadelphia, when they open the doors and they finally come out, she's standing there and she says, famously in this scene, Dr. Franklin, what have you wrought in there? What have you given us? And he says, a republic, madam, if you can keep it. Because he knew it was up to each one of us, the tradesmen, the artisans, to make the compromises, to do the balances, to have the humility or the pretense of humility that would save a democratic republic for the ages. You know, each one of the people I wrote about, even at the end, you could see the essence of their character. You know, with Einstein, it's 1955, he's in Princeton, he has an aorta that is burst, he decides not to have an operation. So he's lying in Princeton Hospital, he knows he has a day or two to live, and he asks Helen Dukas, his secretary, to bring the papers from his office. And so late his last evening, after the visitors had gone, he picked up the papers from his bedside, and he actually wrote 9 full pages of equations. He talked about the spirit manifest in the laws of the universe, the ones that would explain, and he was trying to get that unified field theory that he thought, you know, would capture it. A unified field theory that would tell you how force fields interact with particles, or, to put it more simply, why the compass needle twitches and points north. I went to Hebrew University, where they actually have those papers, because I just wanted to physically be in the presence of them, because you see, as, you know, he makes math mistakes and crosses them out, and at the end of the 9th page, you see when the pain gets too great, and it dribbles off, it just falls off the bottom of the page, as he tried to write one last line of equations that he thought would get him and the rest of us just one step closer to the spirit manifest in the laws of the universe. And as for Steve, it was just about 2 years ago, in the summer of 2011, when, you know, he realized, I realized, people realized he might not, as he put it, stay one step ahead of the cancer, get to one more lily pad. And I spent a lot of time talking to him about legacy. And I said, what is, do you think, the legacy, the meaning of life? He said, well, I've always looked at life as being like a river. And there's wonderful things in the river because people who've come before you have put things in the river, ways of doing business, wonderful products, great theories and ideas and things that you can use. And you get to take those things out of the river. He said, as I face, what may be the end, I realize, I keep thinking, it's not how much you get to take out of the river. It's what you put back into the river. What you put back in that people later will say, that was shiny, that was cool, look at what that person put back in. And as for Benjamin Franklin, during his lifetime, he donated to the building fund of each and every church that was built in Philadelphia. And at one point, they were building a new hall for itinerant preachers of the Great Awakening who were coming by. And it's still there. If you look to the left of Independence Hall, it's still called the New Hall. And he wrote the fundraising document for it. It began by saying, even if the Mufti of Constantinople were to send somebody here to preach Islam to us and to teach us about the Prophet Muhammad, we should offer them a pulpit and listen, for we might learn. And on his deathbed, he's the largest individual contributor to the Mikveh Israel Synagogue, the first synagogue built in Philadelphia. So when he dies, instead of his minister accompanying his casket to the grave, all 35 ministers, preachers, and priests link arms with the rabbi of the Jews in Philadelphia to march with him to the grave. It was that type of spirit, a spirit of bringing people together, a spirit of realizing that in diversity of ideas, diversities of people, come our strength. It was that type of view of life that they were fighting for back then and that we're still fighting for in the world today. So thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you very much. Walter Isaacson has agreed to take some questions from the audience, so if you would please, in council rule, raise your arm high, wait for the mic, and please make sure your question is in fact a question. Yeah, right over here, please. Karen Kane.
You can break the rule and make a statement.
Thank you so much. You have such an amazing ability to enter into the lives of your characters, the people you've written about. But I wonder if there's an element of seduction when you encounter a live subject, as you did with Steve Jobs.
Well, yeah, and you can ask either Dr. Kissinger or Steve Jobs or his family, how well I got seduced, because you do have to worry about it, but you also have to try to be unbelievably honest. In fact, Steve told me over and over again, when there's tales in this book that I didn't think he would like, and he said, you've got to be honest. Just be he said, people think I was a jerk. I wasn't being a jerk. I was being brutally honest. You got to be brutally honest in the book. Janet Malcolm and others have always said that, whether you're a journalist or a biographer, it is partly a thing of seduction and then seduction and betrayal. And I think there's an intellectual dishonesty in that. I think you really have to be upfront when you're writing about things. I will say that, once again, if you look at the Kissinger book, as Lester's laughing, Kissinger, who was very good at seducing people, he was not exactly thrilled with the outcome. In fact, he didn't speak to me for quite a while. Remember, I got 7 letters on the day the book came out, and he was reading it, all hand-delivered by Jerry Bremer, who was then his Connor Crown, who went on to become the vice regent of Iraq, which I hope Connor doesn't do. But, and it was always the letters, it is absolutely outrageous that you would write blah, 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 blah. So he didn't speak to me. I did, we did honor him last week at the Aspen Institute dinner, and as he told the story, he told it on himself, so I can say it. After not speaking to me for quite a while, I got a phone call from him, because Time was bringing back all the people who've been on the cover, and he goes, "Well, Walter, even the 30 Years' War had to end at some point." What he did not say, and I hope you don't repeat when you get back to him, because this was to a dinner, and he says, "But you know my wife Nancy, she's partial to the 100 Years' War. This may be more difficult." So I do think, but I will say after that your very question came to my mind. Seduction, betrayal, honesty, did I get it right? Did I go too far, bend over backwards, all these things. And I said to myself afterwards, next time I'm going to do somebody who's been dead for 200 years. And that's why I did Dr. Franklin. I did feel that way after Steve Jobs, and now I'm going into the Wayback Machine for my next book.
Great, next question. Yeah, the woman right over here, please. Yeah, the mic's right beside you.
Thank you for coming today. I have a question. I was at Monticello and I looked at some papers, Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptists. Are you familiar with the document?
Yeah, it's the first one that uses the phrase separation of church and state, right?
Correct. But what was interesting to me, and you know that Jefferson invented the machine that
Copied it, yeah.
copied.
Yeah.
So the letter went to the Danbury Baptists, but somewhere there's another copy that hasn't been
Yeah.
found yet. But the copy at Monticello, there is something in front of separation, and it's illegible because it's been scratched out.
Oh, dear.
And what I'd like to know is, how could you get CSI-style crime lab to analyze what scratched it out, the origin of the ink, whether it was contemporaneous with that time?
Well, I'll answer in a more broad way.
I'm a Jungian, by the way, so I'm not an atheist, but I'm a Jungian.
Okay. I do think that we are getting better technologies, to be able to analyze documents. In fact, we analyzed the document, the first draft of the Declaration, to figure out whose handwriting it was. You do cross out something where it's, endowed by the Creator. There's actually a lot crossed out. And so you can do things like that. What's particularly interesting, though, to me, is back then people wrote a whole lot of letters. This is not exactly the question you asked, but I will say this about it, because I've been to the Jefferson letters at Monticello, the Franklin letters, which were at Yale, Einstein's, which are Hebrew University and Caltech, and it's amazing. 50, 60 letters per day. You know every single thought, whatever's happening. Great lines of Ben Franklin, leave aside the separation of church, when he talks about religion, over and over again in letters, and we'll say it one way to his sister, another way to the Reverend, Stiles of, New Haven, and so you watch things form. When we were doing a book called The Wise Men, which was about American foreign policy, I say we because it was a friend of mine named Evan Thomas, and something happens in 1958, 1959, which is an unheralded event that's bad for writing history, which is, up until then, you could go to the Brown Brothers Harriman New York Historical Society and see that Harriman and Lovett wrote each other every day, and sometimes twice a day, because the mail was delivered. Suddenly, in 1958, something called direct long-distance dialing comes in. You can just pick up the phone and dial. And it's all you start getting are phone messages. Call me about Dien Bien Phu. Call me about Cambodia. And you lose the paper trail. So, it's going to be complicated for future historians. We used to have tapes until Richard Nixon messed that up. We used to have, now thanks to the NSA, people talk about the NSA scandal. I'm like telling the NSA, just keep them so that, historians can use every email that Ivo has sent to Susan Rice saying, what are you doing on Syria? We want to know that exchange, which only the NSA is keeping for us. So maybe I'm hoping there'll be another way we will get information, and I'm sorry that the elders of the Danbury Church question I didn't fully answer for you, but someday we will know what they tried to say. Yes?
Thanks. Ben Orzeski right
Sure.
there, please. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Just keep talking, it'll.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You started off talking about your subjects.
I'll repeat it.
In common,
Yeah.
imagination.
Get the new mic.
Yeah.
Sorry, can
You're
you get the other
wondering
mic
if
over quick?
I'll repeat it. Go ahead.
You started off talking about your subjects. The quality they had in common was their imagination, and I'm wondering whether after studying them you think that that's innate or learnable.
Well, everything is to some extent, or almost everything is to some extent, both, in terms of personalities and whatever. If you asked Einstein that question, he would explain to you why he ran away from the German school system. He was being taught by rote. He had to memorize a periodic chart and the multiplication tables and whatever. And any questioning of authority was not something that actually got you ahead in the gymnasiums of the German state school system. Likewise, Kissinger will tell you that. So he went to a Pestalozzi school, which I describe in the book, but just imagine it's like a Montessori, but more visual ways of learning, creativity, hands-on project. And he felt that that was deeply important to ingraining his creativity. You know, for a Steve Jobs, you know, I asked him, why were you so much more creative than Bill Gates? Because in some ways, I think Bill Gates is much smarter in a conventional sense than Steve. If you watch Bill Gates, he, you know, can have 4 screens going, each split, and do with mental processing power, you know, analyze data, where Steve is very intuitive and creative and artistic. And, you know, but Steve creates the iPod and Bill Gates creates the Zune, you know. Anybody in this room remember what the Zune was? It was, you know, Microsoft's attempt to create an MP3 music player. It looked like it was made in Kazakhstan. You know, it was just horrible. So I said, why? You know, you all have similar backgrounds. I mean, other than the fact that you dropped out of Reed and he dropped out of Harvard, it's not that different. And he said, if Bill had only dropped acid and gone to an ashram in India once or twice, he might have had some taste. So there's 100 or 1,000 answers to what makes somebody more creative. Obviously, there are people who are born to just be rebels and to be creative. Steve was born to be a rebel. Do you have to be a rebel to be creative and innovative? It's something I explore in the book. You do need somewhat of a rebellious streak if you're going to like what's been handed down to you as received wisdom, either in the first paragraph of Newton's Principia or from the teachers in the German gymnasium. You're not going to be as rebellious. You're not going to be as creative. On the other hand, you know, it does help, as I said, to learn what's in the box. So, you know, I just don't think there's one strict formula. I also think, because people will tell me, oh, you know, Einstein, wasn't he, you know, Asperger's? Wasn't he ADD? Wasn't he dyslexic or something? You know, all these things that people try to claim. I said, you know, everybody's different. Everybody learns differently. It really does help to understand what is a person's particular way of learning. Is it visual, like Steve? Is it analytic, like Bill Gates? Let them learn and let them progress and let them flourish based on certain innate talents they have, and encourage those talents to be creative, to be celebrated, whether it's, you know, a rebellious, creative, you know, visual thinker, or a button-down geek who can tell you Jeff Torborg's ERA from the, you know, 1968 Dodgers. You know, whatever it may be about that person, you want to let that flourish. And I think that's really the only way to instill creativity, is not try to put everybody in a cookie-cutter thing. It's why when, you know, I've been involved with the school system with New Orleans, I know y'all are doing it here in Chicago, and it's always a struggle. But I believe there should be many different types of schools and many different types of choices. And one of the things we have a problem in the United States is we tend to have a certain type of way of doing school, and you have to pretty much, unless you're wealthy enough to move to a different zip code or go to a private school, you're pretty much assigned to a particular school, as opposed to saying, let there be, like Einstein, who was a runaway, had, to be able to find different ways of learning in different types of schools.
Thanks. Next question. Yeah, the gentleman with the glasses, please. No, sorry, behind him. Thank you. Just one second. No, Libby, you're okay.
You both can ask it simultaneously, and I'll
Thank you. As an international student, my question will be precise. Considering that Kissinger was a national security advisor, how do you think he would have advised the president on the Snowden affair? On this
On which
espionage-
affair?
On Snowden.
Snowden.
This spying affair that has affected the U.S. government?
Yeah, no, I definitely, it's always, I was hoping you were going to ask about Syria or Iran, because I've just heard him hold forth on, know exactly what he would advise people on at length, I've heard. On Snowden, it's always difficult to say, you know, what would Einstein think about, you know, school choice, or, well, you know, you don't want to, but, you know, Henry Kissinger, one of his tragic flaws was an obsession with secrecy. Secret bombing of Cambodia was not exactly the best way to institutionalize a sustainable foreign policy. The various secret ways, even the opening to China, is done in secret. He really believed, because he did not have a fingertip appreciation for democracy and for the openness that is the strength of a democracy, he was always quite secretive in how he approached things. That made him fanatic about leaks, to get back to Mr. Snowden. And if you read the history of it, the whole Watergate plumbers, it starts with leaks out of Henry Kissinger's shop, I think by Roger Morris, and even Bill Sapphire's leaking. So they start wiretapping the people who are working for Henry Kissinger, and Kissinger's the one doing, with Nixon, the wiretapping. And that creates a plumbers unit. The plumbers unit is called the plumbers because it's there to fix leaks. It's run by Chuck Colson and everything else. You probably know the history of what happens when the plumbers unit goes to the Watergate to try to stop some leaks. So I do, without knowing exactly what Dr. Kissinger feels about Edward Snowden, I do believe that he was so obsessed with leaks, and his history was always to just go to the extreme when anybody was leaking, that he would feel that way. I also think that that's wrong. I mean, I'm not somebody who's ever going to defend Snowden, but being obsessed with leaks is sometimes worse than the leak itself. And the crackdowns on leaking have always caused more problems. So, you know, I don't think he would agree with my last statement.
Okay, we'll try the other man with the glasses there, please.
Anybody who has glasses on, stand up and, or borrow glasses from the person next to you.
Well, I'm the second man with glasses. Two things. First is you made a reference to Frank Lloyd Wright, somebody following him. He had a quote, which I can't do exactly about it. He had the choice between humility and honest arrogance, and he chose honest arrogance. He might be an interesting source for another biography, especially in relationship to the kind of innovators that he had as his client. I want to go back to Henry Kissinger and Benjamin Franklin. Your comparisons, to a great extent, were across the scientific nature of your other, or technological nature. How would you compare Kissinger and Franklin as statesmen and diplomats?
Yeah, you know, that's how it started. I had written a book about Dr. Kissinger, and as I joked, said next person could be somebody who's been dead for 200 years. But the reason I landed on Franklin and was interested in him is in the very last chapter of my Kissinger book, there is a discussion of the role of realism in American foreign policy. And as you know, the great balance in American foreign policy is between our idealistic impulses, to spread democracy and be good in this world, and our realist impulses, which are to support, the Saudis or whoever might be, people who help protect our national interests. And there's no right answer there. In fact, our foreign policy is usually stronger when we weave together, an ability to understand our ideals and also understand our interests. But to the extent that Kissinger had tilted towards one side, he tilted very decidedly towards the side of realism. He believed that any idealistic or moralistic component of foreign policy was what he called sentimentality, and it had no role to play in foreign policy. At one point, when we decide to abandon the Kurds because of our need to support the Shah of Iran, he said foreign policy should not be confused with missionary work. So he is not a moralist or idealist in foreign policy. He is a hardcore realist, a Bismarckian, Metternich realist. As he will say, and has his book, Diplomacy, which is an awesomely great book, starting with Cardinal Richelieu, making fun of Woodrow Wilson, who's a great idealist, exalting Teddy Roosevelt, who's a great realist. It's an argument for realism, not idealism, in foreign policy. So having dealt with that last chapter, it became clear to me we don't have that many pure realists in the history of American foreign policy, right? You can maybe say Teddy Roosevelt, but, generally, even a Nixon, they're doing things because they believe they want to spread, America's values, not just protect its economic security interests. So I was looking for the roots of realism in American foreign policy, and I started reading about Benjamin Franklin, who is an unbelievable diplomat. During that period, as I say, after the Declaration, they do that wonderful paragraph, they send him back in his late 70s across the ocean back to France, because we have to get France in on our side of the war in order to win it, and France, even back then, was a bit of a handful, so they send Dr. Franklin, who seduces everybody there, literally and figuratively. But what he does is he combines the two themes. He builds a printing press to print the Declaration and the other idealistic documents of America, talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and equality, et cetera, things that are rising, of course, in the French populace side. But he plays, and nobody had written about this. I'd looked at all the biographies of Franklin. They're all written by English professors who think he's sitting there in Paris writing poetry to his mistresses, when he's in fact a diplomat. What he does is not just print these things and be an idealist. He does the best balance of power realist game you've ever seen in American foreign policy. Somebody really should do a book just on it, because he's able to convince France that France and the other Bourbon-packed nations, the Netherlands, Spain, whatever, in there, he understands, unlike most Americans, that this revolution is not just some war between Britain and the United States. It's part of a 100-year war between Britain and France, and the French and Indian War, and all that's a part of it. And our revolution is actually part of this larger struggle for global dominance between the Bourbon-packed nations and England. So he starts hanging around and writing wonderful letters to Vaughan, the French foreign minister, which give a really clear view of a realist balance of power game of what will happen if France comes in on our side and has navigation rights on the Mississippi, and what it will do to the balances of power, and France comes in. Not because he printed the Declaration of Independence, not because he hugged Voltaire on the steps of the Academy, but because he and Vaughan created a treaty and a whole deal that was an ultimate balance of power realism. So to me, nobody did balance of power realism better than Franklin, but nobody also was better at weaving together the notion of exalting our ideals while pursuing also a realist foreign policy. So that's how I contrast him with Franklin. And I think I have 2 chapters, probably bored a lot of people, 2 chapters just on the French diplomacy, because I got very interested, and then the last chapter of the Kissinger book, which leads into it.
Thanks. Any questions over at the back side of the, yeah, in the back row there's a question, please. Thank you. The mic's coming. Yeah, in there, thank you.
Hi there, thank you very much. Couple of questions. How do you choose your biographical subjects? Who's on the short list as next subjects? Do you read biographies? What ones would you recommend?
I read biographies. I read them avidly. I would recommend Caro's latest volume on Lyndon Johnson. Actually, I don't care about recommending it to you. I wish Obama would read that volume, which is how he could get Everett Dirksen and every other member of the Republican Party totally cowed every time they came to the Oval Office. I started Doris Kearns Goodwin's book on Teddy Roosevelt and the bully pulpit and the press and Taft, but it just came out last week. I used my biography subject somewhat at random, and I did this Wise Men book with my friend Evan when we were just coming out of college, working at time, and it ended in Vietnam, and I wanted to figure out how do you do Vietnam coming out of the Wise Men, and the best way to do it was through Kissinger. We were working at Time magazine, and Henry Luce, who invented Time, said, tell the history of our time through people, through the people who make it. Somebody once accused him of personality journalism and doing it that way. He said, no, we didn't decide to do it that way. That's the way the Bible does it. You tell the tales through people. So, I sort of got interested in doing it through people. Having said that, and I picked, as I say, Kissinger coming out of the Wise Men, Franklin I picked coming out of Kissinger for reasons I mentioned. Having read about Franklin and said nobody's ever treated him well as a diplomat, I realized this guy's an awesome scientist, and he would have thought you were a Philistine if you didn't love science, right? And and the electricity experiments are really serious. So I decided I wanted to try to do a scientist next, and Einstein being a very intimidating scientist, but also an interesting guy, figured I could do it through him. So it's sort of a random walk, but looking at creativity, imagination, and how it connects the arts and the sciences, because we don't connect the arts and sciences enough. All the people I write about, especially Steve Jobs, knew that the connection of art to technology or art to science was important. So on that theme, the book I'm working on now, first of all, is not a biography, because as a biographer, you learn that you distort history a little bit by thinking it's somebody sitting in a garage or padding around the Prussian Academy who suddenly comes up with things. That most creativity is collaborative. It comes from groups working together. Something that I knew when we wrote The Wise Man, understood from Ben Franklin, but as a biographer, you kind of mess that up. You overemphasize the role of the lone individual. So it's a collective biography of the people who created the computer and the internet, starting with John von Neumann, Alan Turing, how they work together, what collaborative creativity is about. It actually starts with a woman, too, because I do feel that women in the history of science have been underreported. And there's a wonderful woman named Ada Lovelace, Lord Byron's child. And when she was growing up, as you could probably imagine, Lady Byron was not very fond of Lord Byron. And so wanted to make sure that Ada Byron did not become a poet. And so she had her tutored only in mathematics. I mean, it was back then where you could do that. And she becomes a great mathematician, but she's also a poet. And she does what she calls poetical science. She pulls together the beauty of poetry with mathematics. And she creates computer algorithms for the Babbage's difference engine. She's the first person to understand that calculating machines can do more than just numbers. They can do notes, they can do words, they can do tapestry patterns if you create the right algorithm. So the concept of connecting beauty to technology and a computer algorithm comes from Ada Byron, Lady Lovelace she becomes. And so I'm doing a book starting with her, once again trying to connect the notion of the arts and the notion of the sciences to create real innovation.
Sorry. Oh, okay, great. Well, we can have you talk to him after the book line. Thanks. Yeah, right here, he's in the second line. Jump forward. Thanks.
Yes, I'm wondering if how Kissinger fits into the qualities that the other three shared, thinking out of the box and being creative and linking the arts with the sciences. Or
Well, Kissinger was very creative and imaginative. I mean, leave aside the darker side I talked about, the secrecy, the secret bombing, et cetera, is that Evo could probably do it better, and at some point you could have you could have Henry Kissinger come and explain to you why he's so creative. He would do so in a heartbeat. But the creativity of Henry Kissinger came as we were coming out of Vietnam, and it was a balance of power creativity, which is understanding that you could take the world balance, which was then the, communist versus the free world type of thing, and create a triangular balance by having an opening to China, playing China off against the Soviets, keeping that triangular balance as a way to help extricate us from Vietnam, but also having a détente with the Soviet Union, balancing it against the Chinese. Up until then, we really hadn't considered that you could play China off against Russia that way. And that triangular balance of power created out of what had been a bipolar balance of power was both creative, but it also saved the possibility of U.S. diplomacy and U.S. influence as we had to extricate ourselves from Vietnam. Henry could do it better. He would think that was understating his creativity.
We'll have it back for our program together, right? Carolyn, please.
I wondered if you were going to include Mary Somerville in with...
Yeah, Mary Somerville was, not of course, I didn't know this until I started studying it, was the tutor of Ada Byron Lovelace. Mary Somerville was not only a great mathematician, but was a pioneer as being the first woman to truly be accepted as a scientist and mathematician.
Another question, and I was at Somerville.
You were at Somerville College, Oxford?
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
How will your successors as biographers and historians work, say, from the period of, well, 10 years ago on, with virtually no written correspondence.
Yeah.
I mean, I've talked to the chief historian of the Joint Chiefs of Staff about this. How they're going to get through emails, God knows.
Yeah, I mean, I made the joke about the NSA being our only hope if they'll keep all these things that they're eavesdropping on. I've actually worked pretty hard, both at Harvard and other places, where people are gathering papers. Say, for example, Arthur Rock, some of you may know. Great guy, he's given all his papers to Harvard. So I keep saying, well, what about your emails? Nobody's ever thought of saying, you know, now trust me, Arthur Rock's emails are a lot more interesting, you know, than his papers. When I was doing Steve Jobs, I said, I got to get to your emails. You know, he's a computer genius with a lot of computer geniuses around him. They are looking at old Apples and the next computer he has, in which there are emails. You know, he just has these old machines in the, you know, garage, and they can't even open them up. There's a history project at Harvard on the beginnings of the media and the digital age, basically the late 80s and 90s. Believe it or not, because I care about this sort of thing, I was involved, I ran new media for Time Warner for a while. Every time I got a new computer, would take all my emails, you know, whatever they were in, CompuServe email, and then AOL, and then Microsoft Outlook, and I'd give it to the IT department, and I'd say, convert it so that this entire set of emails will be readable on my new computer. Over and over again, I did that over the course of 20, 25 years. And even when 2 years ago we were doing this project, about half of them we had to get specialists to open up. I finally figured out the best way to save emails is print them out and put them in a shoebox. I mean, papers of really good technology, you discover, much better than electronic technology. But it is hard to get people to save or donate their emails. Bill Gates' emails are probably the most important thing, you know, you could get. And yet he's not saving them and donating them with his papers to Harvard. So I do despair that we're not going to have the written record. Certainly we're not going to have things, you know, as I say, memoirs or diaries or letters, because they all get subpoenaed. What we do have making up for it a little bit, and you'll laugh, but I mean this seriously, is these sort of quick books that come out, whether it's Bob Woodward or Heilman and Mark Halperin, Double Down, whatever, where they're interviewing everybody, you know, behind the scenes to say, what did you say to the president, whatever. And so at least you get a rough draft of hopefully 3 or 4 versions of what happened. I don't know. I just hope we save our emails in the future because we don't have much other written documentation. Thank you.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, that's all we have time for.
I'm going to go over there and sign books. If you have a book, I'll come do it. Thank you all.